Common Core has officially failed. We'll show you how. What's next? I'll tell you what won't happen. Not one single creator, abettor, promoter, or apologist for Common Core will suffer the slightest consequence for trashing American education. So thanks. Thanks for something worse than nothing. Bill Gates, Barack Obama, David Coleman, Jeb Bush, and the whole damn progressive educrat clown car. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is the Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. It's been nearly a decade since Common Core invaded the public school classrooms. Textbooks, teaching pedagogy, everything changed across the country. And now all data points to exactly the same outcome as we expected, a complete, colossal, and utterly unredeemable failure. So what's next? I'll tell you what's, go back to my opening here, Katie, and as somebody who spent a lot of my life over the last decade dealing with this, the most insulting aspect of all of this is that 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, 7 years ago, 4 years ago, we all told them this was going to happen. We knew it was going to happen. It was obvious it was going to happen. But the reality now, 10 years in, when we have, and our second story is going to completely document now how all this has failed, thanks to the Pioneer Institute. But where we are now, looking back 10 years, you realize one thing, that all of this fighting, all of our debating, every piece of evidence we brought to the table was never, ever going to be taken seriously. That the minute these educrats, and I named just a few of them at the beginning of the tease for the show, they had decided this was the way to go. They had decided that a very small, unelected, with the exception of President Obama, an unelected group of people with very little educational experience in their back pockets, decided they were going to transform education into something that was soul-affirming, something that was positively individual, something that allowed people, children, to become what they were meant to be, to follow those paths, to give them a general broad education in basic literacy, and to allow them to figure out over the course of that broad education where they wanted to spend their life and what they wanted to focus on. They transformed that system into a system that was radically utilitarian. We're going to get rid of truth and beauty. We're going to get rid of allowing children to decide for themselves what they will be. We're going to, in the name of social justice and technocracy and the fact that the national business councils, right, the chambers of commerce wanted cheap labor. If someday, somehow, someone was going to close those borders down, right, we need cheap, uneducated labor to fill our factories. That's what they did. And so we're going to show you now how it failed. And the whole point of showing you it is not going to change anything. This is not, all these statistics, all these numbers aren't going to change a thing. The public schools, the superintendents, the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., your state and local education experts and superintendents and principals, this is not going to change one thing once we show it to you. Your schools are broke. They have been broken and remade into something that has very little to do with education. So I can only say to you, you have got to consider alternatives. You have got to if you want a kind of education that allows your children to become what God made them to be, that allows them to become have basic literacy with regards to civics, to history, what actually happened in America, as opposed to the radically liberal 1619 version of history your kids are getting. If you want your kids to be able to be moved forward, if you want merit and if you want achievement to be recognized, you have got to get your kids out of these schools.
So while we let Duke cool down for just a moment, let's take a look at actually what you are backing this up with all the data. So we have story coming out talking about the Pioneer Institute. They actually released a study last week, and it revealed the historic drop in the reading scores, the math scores, overall just what the failure is of the Common Core. And here's my shock face that it failed. So the Pioneer Executive Director, Jim Sturgis, said nearly a decade after states adopted Common Core, the empirical evidence makes it clear that these national standards have yielded underwhelming results for students. The proponents of this expensive, legally questionable policy initiative have much to answer for.
And where are the answers? right? Bill Gates' response to scratch his head in that kind of low blood sugar way he has, to look into the camera, and after defending China because of their innocence in the Wuhan virus, he'll then turn to pivot about Common Core and talk about, well, we gave it a stab with Common Core, and so what we need to do is double down, right? That will be Bill Gates' response. He's already made that response. The answer is they answer to nothing. That's already been done. It's already the DNA now. I mean, and I said this a lot before the first couple years we were talking about this. If we don't do this, if we don't fix this now, back in 2013, 2014, 2015, when we had a chance, if we don't stop this, inevitably, the entire DNA structure of American education will change. It's not the same thing it was anymore. There are no topical fixes, right? You can't just chop something off. This is not like postmodern gender theory, right? Where you take a few pills and you lop something off and suddenly a man is a girl. No, the fundamental DNA remains the same. The DNA of American public schooling has transformed now. It's not about what you think it is. It's not about school. It's not about education. It's not about achievement. It's not about preparing your kids for college even. It's about social engineering, and that takes 1,000 different points, right? Social engineering in 1,000 different ways, from your kid's gender to your kid's view of the United Nations, but that's what they're doing now.
And you all along, over this entire time, have been consistent in saying the dangers of it, and yet you were mocked, laughed at, cursed at. You basically had the whole gamut run at you.
There's a lot of us. I mean, there are so many of us. Ted Rebarber at Pioneer was who produced this wonderful survey show, this demonstration. We brought Ted to Wisconsin to testify against this garbage. Sandy Stotsky, there's so many people I can't even name. There's so many. It's a we, not an I thing. We were all right about this. And the tragic, heartbreaking, unforgivable aspect of this is that we're sitting there telling these technocrats, these educrats, the truth, and they're not only are they ignoring the truth, they're making it seem like you're some kind of a subversive lunatic. That's the world we inhabit now.
So looking specifically at the data now, Pioneer Institute, as we said, released this study. And the study is actually called The Common Core Debacle, and it was authored by, as you said, education policy researcher Theodore, or Ted, Rebarber, and it asserts the shocking trends in American student performance in critical math and reading skills since the creation of the U.S. Education Department 40 years ago. And basically, taking a look at some of the data, we know how horrible and clear-cut it is that the pre-Common Core era versus the post-Common Core era. So if you look at between the fourth graders in the gray, if you're looking at the chart, and the eighth graders in the red, before Common Core, the decade before Common Core, they were having an average gain of 0.7 points. So they were gaining every year, okay? Then you look at post-Common Core, and they are decreasing, and the worst is the eighth graders as they're moving on, and what they should be doing in math at that point is algebra and moving on to the harder math. They are decreasing clearly.
Yeah, we have said this from the beginning as well, that one of the major problems with Common Core altogether, particularly in its math, is that at the lowest grade levels, you're asking kids to do things that are intellectually above them. So the little kids, and this is true of English too, when you're feeding, we've talked about this so many times, when you're feeding an English class, right, or English language arts class, when you're feeding kids that are 6 and 7 gender theory, their little minds cannot go there, right? They know boy and they know girl, right? But they don't know what in between is. Their minds have not developed abstractly. It's even worse in math, where you're actually asking children, tiny kids, to conceptualize math abstractly, right? Math is abstract enough, but when you start forcing young kids to try to write about math or to transform numbers into symbols, you are destroying them. And on the flip side, by the time they get to 8th grade, they're doing way too little math. They're reading way too simplistic stuff. And so this is not a bug. This is not a mistake. It's a feature of what they're doing.
And as you said, the English scores also decreased mightily during,
you can see it right there,
during the Common Core era. So before that, they were gaining both in the 4th grade and the 8th grade level. And then once Common Core hits, they are decreasing more rapidly than they were ever gaining before. So it's completely an inverse. And as we know, because our kids are not reading, and what they are
reading,
they're being told by sight words and how to read.
Yes, they're not taught phonics, number one. They're not
They are not hooked on phonics.
No, they don't know. Phonics is the way to teach kids to read. We're doing this sight and it's absolutely ridiculous. But they're not even reading books. You know how many of my freshmen in high school, I had a college, I have a bunch of freshmen at the beginning of this semester. And the vast majority of them had never read a single book. Not one book. They read paragraphs from books now. They don't read Shakespeare. They'll take one scene of Shakespeare. It'll be translated into the most boring modern English, and that's all they talk about.
And then they'll reenact or redo the scene in more modern times to be hip about that. So
politically correct.
That's completely don't get it. And that is what you see because the kids you're getting now in college, you can see it on their ACT scores that since the implementation of Common Core, both in math and in English. In math, the scores overall have gone down. Yes, it says 0.5 it's gone down, but the whole point is, wasn't Common Core supposed to make our math scores go up? And we put all these millions and millions of dollars into it, and
billions.
And
not
this
only
is the
was
result.
Common Core math said that it was more rigorous, right?
Yes.
Yeah. If you want to torment a 6-year-old, Common Core math is your thing. But if you want to challenge an 8th grader, no, it's not rigorous at all. And if you want to destroy a high school kid's math career, do Common Core. But these are all features of this. And even worse than this, Katie, as we've got some information on, the reason we needed Common Core, we were told, is because we had to close the gap between the high-achieving kids and the low-achieving kids. Guess, America, go ahead and guess, which kids suffer the most under Common Core? If you guessed minority kids in inner cities who are getting hammered even more than non-minority kids, you got it right. So not only did Common Core completely undermine your kids' education in the name of social justice, the very people they were doing it for, minority inner city kids, are falling farther behind than ever before.
And we're going to talk about that more in the next segment, but I want to get a quote here from Barber, who said that the sustained decline we're now seeing, especially among our most vulnerable students, simply cannot be allowed to continue. It's time for federal law to change to allow states as well as local school districts to try a broader range of approaches to reform. With a more bottom-up approach, more school systems will have the opportunity to choose curricula consistent with our international competitors and many decades of research on effective classroom teaching.
With all due respect to Ted, he said that 10 years ago. He was right 10 years ago. And in the 10 years that we've had to prove this, education went from a local district thing to a state thing, and now it belongs exclusively to the federal government of the United States of America, thanks to the Republicans who passed the ESSA Act in December of 2016 to make sure that all of this nastiness that went on in your kid's school is now legally protected. Ted's right. That's what you should do. But do you honestly think, let me ask you this, Mom and Dad, do you honestly think the Federal Department of Education is going to close? No. Trump said he'd do it. Bush said he'd do it. Reagan said he'd do it. None of them did it. It's not going anywhere. If you realize that the Federal Department of Education isn't going away, that's why you must realize that they're never giving the schools back to you. The only chance is to get out.
And on to our next story, which is continuing on with this Common Core debacle. We have a story from Walter E. Williams. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University, and he wrote a piece for the Daily Wire called Progressive Cities and Black Education. And in the piece, he actually discusses a report by Chris Stewart that we've talked about before. The report is titled The Secret Shame: How America's Most Progressive Cities Betray Their Commitment to Educational Opportunity for All. And what's worth noting on this study is that Stewart himself is a self-described liberal. So for this study to reveal, basically show progressive cities in a negative light is kind of worth noting. And so what actually happened, Walter E. Williams took a look at all the data, and it basically shows how bad and how wide of a gap we now have between white students and black students and Latino students in both math and in reading. So if you take a look at the overall chart that they have, they actually broke this down between those districts that are considered progressive districts and those that are conservative. And if you're taking a look at the chart, you can see clear cut that if you live in a progressive district, the gap between your achievement in both math and reading is much wider than if you lived in a conservative district.
Yeah, and this comes down to one thing. ideology, right? The takeover of education by the progressive educrats was an ideological takeover. It was not educational. And I know that it should seem obvious now, but I need to restate it because it hasn't been stated in a long time, that the people who did this, again, they didn't do it to fix education. They did not do it to make education more rigorous. They didn't do it to make education more profound or deep. They didn't do it to raise literacy rates. They did this to accommodate the fact that they could not, in their social justice policies, they could not bring the lowest performing kids up. Most of those lowest performing kids are in big, progressive, Democrat cities, right?
Like which ones?
Like Cleveland, like New York, like Detroit, like San Francisco. Nancy Pelosi's city by the bay is at the worst at looking after minority kids. Cue the chart.
And that's the thing. If you take a look at math achievement gaps in 12 of the most progressive cities, San Francisco has a 58-point gap between the white students and the black students. They have a 49-point gap between the Latino students and the white students. San Francisco has Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi, you would say, well, okay, well, she's not at the state, she's at the federal. Well, take a look, DC's even on there. So anywhere Nancy goes, it's bad news.
Ice cream for everybody.
That's how we fix this.
And you know about this chart, too, with Nancy. The thing about it's all these are big cities. Every one of them are major big cities that are run by Democrats, right? There's not one on that list that isn't. And the point being that what they're doing here, and what's really interesting to me is they left Asians off that. That chart, can you imagine what would have happened with that chart? What do you think the gap is between Asian achievement in math right there in San Francisco? And because obviously San Francisco is a huge Asian population. If you put the Asians on there, who clearly would outdo the whites, that gap between the Asian achievers who are also immigrants, who are also inner city people, who are also supposed to be part of the minority victimhood, white privilege and all that, if you put the Asians in there, I'll bet that gap would be about 70.
Well, if you put the gap with the Asians and the whites, it would be a negative score because they may actually surpass the whites.
Oh, they absolutely would.
It would actually be a negative score. And then let's take a look at the reading scores as well. They're just as bad, or if not worse. 58-point gap in San Francisco, a 60-point gap in D.C. between blacks and whites. What's fascinating, if you're able to see this chart, they actually have it so that Detroit, the gap is only 2. But Katie, you said this is supposed to be such a wide gap. Well, if you look at the overall scores, the whites were only getting a 15% proficiency. It's so bad that a 2% or a 2-point gap is actually okay, but it's in the teens of proficiency overall from anyone. So that's its own beast.
It's so bad in Detroit that the numbers and this is where San Francisco's going. This is where these other schools are going. Detroit's dysfunction as a Democrat city is even worse than others. This is the future for all American education, what's happening in Detroit.
And that's what Williams' point is in the story he wrote. And Williams, we should note, is African-American because he's the one who's saying that his profound contribution to this is that the reason that we are having all these issues, his idea, he says my guess is that part of the reasons black academic achievement is greater in conservative cities is that schools are less tolerant of crime, whereas schools in progressive cities make excuses. That's right. It's time for some real education. And today we're going to look at a giant column, a column named to commemorate Roman Emperor Trajan's victory in the Dacian Wars. Since he appears on the column 58 times, it's not that hard to guess that it was named after him. So the column was completed in 113 AD and has since inspired such victory columns, as they're called, in both the ancient and modern world. And the top was crowned by Pope Sixtus V with a bronze figure of St. Peter in 1587.
Yeah, interesting. Take a look at the column again. Trajan was a Roman emperor. He ruled the Roman Empire from about 98 AD to 117 AD. And if you know anything about Roman history, the 30-40 years before Trajan became emperor were incredibly complex. You had Nero, you had civil war in Rome, you had the year of the 4 emperors, you had Domitian and the persecution of Christians, you had all sorts of bad stuff. And what Rome desperately needed, the empire was beginning to crumble. People were losing faith in its ability to govern. Trajan, who was born actually in Africa, one of the first African emperors, Trajan was elevated to the throne with people not knowing what to make of him, right? What they were going to be able to do with him. And what ended up happening is he became an amazingly great emperor. He actually fought one of the last great wars that Rome used to expand their boundaries, right? By this time in Roman history, the empire was more or less set. The last time a Roman emperor would engage in a war that would expand Rome's boundaries further was the Dacian War. After that, it would continue to shrink. And the Dacians were a really fierce eastern tribe, horsemen, very, very talented with bows and arrows. And one thing that Trajan did that Roman emperors hadn't done since the time of the Caesars, Trajan actually got on a horse and went to war himself. He actually rode with his armies all the way to the eastern part of the empire. It's a long way on horseback to engage in this battle himself. It's a really wonderful thing in terms of military history. And if you look at the column that commemorates him, the structure is 98 feet in height. And has a very large pedestal. These columns, I think they were ultimately derived from the obelisks, the long, think about the Washington Monument. I think they were ultimately derived from the obelisks that the ancient Greeks used to put up to give information and to commemorate their own victories. This one has beautiful carving. Go to a close-up, Mike. It has beautiful carving all around every niche or all around the column of aspects of the war. Here you have Roman soldiers who are doing heavy lifting. They're creating a fortification, they're building a wall, they're repairing. Because when Roman soldiers weren't fighting, and they were the fiercest fighting force of the ancient world. When they weren't fighting, they were carrying bricks, they were building encampments, they were digging tunnels and moats, they were doing all sorts of fortification work. Just a really incredibly active life. You can see here some of the Roman soldiers as they are marching off to war against the Dacians. And this beautiful column, if you look at the broad picture again, this beautiful column, it kind of winds around, right? And you can see the lines where it's almost like each line is a band in which a story is told. And as Katie pointed out, Trajan appears, was it 58 times on his own column. And of course, there was supposed to be an eagle on the top, but that was lost at some point or never put there. And a Roman Pope, Sixtus, actually put a statue of St. Peter there, which is there to this day.
And that's your Thursday. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you have a question for our Friday Q&A, visit freedomproject.com/askduke or send us a message on social media. Now, let's wrap things up with the fun fact of the day. The current 50-star U.S. flag was actually designed by a 17-year-old named Robert Heft, and it was done for a school project in 1958. He received a B- on the project. Now, meanwhile, he had a friend who picked up 5 leaves off the ground, taped them in a notebook, and he got an A. So the teacher said he'd change Heft's grade if he could get it accepted in Washington. What does he do? 2 years later, 21 letters and 18 phone calls, President Dwight Eisenhower actually called up Heft to say the flag was adopted and asked if he could be at the ceremony.
Aren't there 58 states? Isn't that what Obama said?
I thought there were 92.
I don't know.
I'm so confused.
And that's going to do it for us this show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke. She's Katie. Until next time, stay educated, my friends.